funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.
In January 1847, during the Great Irish Famine, a Polish man named Paul Edmund De Strzelecki travelled from London to County Mayo in the west of Ireland.
What he saw, it went beyond everything he could imagine.
He uses that language that nothing has been exaggerated. This situation is so awful, it's impossible to exaggerate it, and that no pen can describe how bad it is.
It's not an everyday matter to see a nation starve.
The Irish famine, the level of mortality is just incredibly high.
He used Westport as his base. He travelled up to Sligo, down to Galway. He travelled to Belmullet. Again, very moved by what he saw. The people of Belmullet suffered so badly.
Our population was hit very badly because of the famine.
The crucial issue facing the Irish people, which was famine, disease, starvation.
And rather than return to his comfortable home back in London, instead the Polish man Strzelecki stayed on in Ireland for nearly 2 years in order to try save lives. This is his story, the story of Paul De Strzelecki's humanitarian work in Ireland.
Paul Edmund De Strzelecki.
He just came here and saw a horrific situation, didn't double back and go, I'm out of here. Instead, said, right, what can I do about this?
Strzelecki saved over 200,000 children in Ireland.
The lives of about 200,000 children were saved, which was an amazing achievement.
Without his intervention, what would have happened is you would have had a much higher mortality rate amongst children.
It saved children at a period of the famine that was particularly bad.
He was particularly efficient, and he did really outstanding job here.
And before we hear how Paul De Strzelecki ended up in Ireland in 1847 during the Great Famine, first we investigate his Polish roots. Marisa Tilley of the Kosciuszko Heritage Centre in Sydney, Australia.
Paul Edmund De Strzelecki. He was born in Głuszyna, near Poznań. His childhood was very free. The parents were so tolerant towards the children. Children were doing whatever they wanted because parents was also too old to control them properly. So that free spirit in Paul Edmund was developed since he was born.
And although the young Paul Edmund lost each of his parents by the age of 10, nevertheless, due to a liberal upbringing by his extended family, he kept that free spirit. After finishing his schooling, followed by a brief stint in the Prussian army, by his mid-20s, he eventually got a job managing the vast estates of the wealthy Prince Sapieha. It was in this role that he first proved his genius at management, finance and leadership. Marisa Tilley.
Prince Sapieha, he employed him as a plenipotent, it means as a manager of his all properties, huge, one of the biggest properties, landlord properties in Lithuania at that time. Paul went to Lithuania, and of course he was earning very good money. Again, he was excellent. In 4 years, he put together the finances of Sapiehas, and at the end, Prince Sapieha was sick already. When he died in 1829, he left for Paul sum of money in his will.
And with those monies and his own savings, Strzelecki next pursued his passions in life, exploration and science, and he began travelling the world. Eventually in 1839 he arrived into Australia. Professor Christine Keneally, director of the Great Hunger Institute at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, USA.
He was an explorer and a scientist, and he went to Australia and Tasmania, which at that time was known as Van Diemen's Land, and he explored the country. And again, at that time, people didn't really know what lay in the inside of Australia, and most of the time he was just accompanied by a convict and an Aborigine. So we get a sense of this man who's incredibly physically fit, and he was in Australia, Tasmania for 4 years. We know he left his own county, climbed the highest mountain, which he named after a Polish hero. So the highest mountain in Australia is so named because of Strzelecki. And he also discovered gold while he was in Australia, but he was persuaded by the British government to not reveal that information. The British government was very afraid that the convicts who were on the island would maybe lay claim to it themselves, so that was kept a secret. So at the end of 4 years he came back to London and he wrote an account of his explorations, and that really became the definitive work on Australia for decades. So he was very well known in his own field, very, very respected. But he heard what was happening in Ireland.
There was famine in Ireland, and in the beginning, I think 1st of January 1847 in London, a charity was set up by people, just by British people that subscribed money. It was called the British Association for the Relief of Extreme Distress in Ireland.
Hannah Dowling of the Irish Polish Society.
And Strzelecki, he offered his services to that association absolutely free of unpaid, completely unpaid. And he was appointed as an agent to supervise the distribution of supplies.
He was an ideal candidate, and the Relief Association thought about it and they accepted him, and they asked him to go to Ireland immediately. So he set off for Westport in County Mayo in January 1847. We know that that was the coldest winter on record for 100 years, and that as he tried to make his way west of Ireland, there was snow drifts, and often his carriage just couldn't get through the snow, and he was so impatient to get where he had to be that he would often just get out of his carriage and walk, and because he was so physically fit he was able to do that. And so he based himself in Westport, but from there he travelled to many parts of Ireland.
Christine Keneally. And one of the many areas which Strzelecki travelled to was Erris in County Mayo. Dr. Jerry Moran, historian and research fellow at the Social Science Research Centre in NUI, Galway.
When he visits Erris, it is in the height of a major snowstorm. He actually travels to Balmullet on foot from Ballina. So it just gives some idea of his commitment to relief operations in Ireland, to be able to report the fact that he had to travel on foot in the most severe weather conditions. The famine of 1845 to 50 is the first major catastrophe in terms of a famine that Europe has experienced. So that those people who are coming, so whether you're talking about representatives from the British Relief Association, they were absolutely appalled with what they actually witnessed.
Given so freely to the poor and starving man, the comfort of strangers fed the hungry in this land. The comfort of strangers fed the hungry in this land. A horror no pen can describe in the bleak fields of the West, when the anguish of starvation laid whole families to rest. a blight that took 1,000,000 souls, and immigrants set sail, escaping death and poverty when potato harvests fail. Then came a Polish nobleman, Strzelecki was his name. Horrified by what he found, he helped the sick and lame.
When Strzelecki arrived in the west of Ireland, he'd been told by the people on the committee in London that he shouldn't give relief in money. There was a belief that if you gave people relief in money, it would be misused, and so relief should always be given in kind, so probably in food. And that relief, as far as possible, should not be given, what they said, they used the word gratuitously, that something should be asked in return for this relief. And that was very much the philosophy that underpinned the giving of charity in the 19th century, mid-19th century. But when he arrived in County Mayo and he saw the devastation, the poverty, he realised he had to do something immediately. And straight away he gave out small grants of money to committees, he purchased food, and he wrote back to the committee in London saying, I know I have not acted the way you have told me, but this situation requires immediate action, and I have done that. And the committee in London were very respectful of him, and they said, you must do what you see fit. So within a month of being in Mayo, he had given out probably £12,000, which again, multiplied by 100, an incredible amount of money. And it's hard to imagine, we don't have the records, but how many lives were saved because of that, so incredible amount. And he travelled, to the most remote parts of the county of the west of Ireland, and he did realise that he did need support, but other people came forward to support him. So there was a network of British Relief Association agents, but he was the chief agent in Ireland, and they were answerable to him. And two of the people who came forward, again as volunteers, were young aristocratic Irishmen. One of them was from the Butler family in Kilkenny. They'd probably never worked in their lives, yet they felt moved to come forward, and they spent the first part of 1847 working in the west of Ireland under Strzelecki, giving out relief.
He organised very high quality volunteers around. A lot of them died of typhoid and high fever, which they contained from the sick people. But he organised them first.
Historian Marisa Tilley. Here's Jerry Moore.
Maybe anything up to 3/4 of the excess deaths as a result of the famine are largely caused by famine-related diseases.
And unfortunately, in April 1847, the physically tough Strzelecki was himself laid low by famine fever. Hannah Dowling.
He was not well for some time because he got this famine fever, and in fact he was physically very strong, when he was young he was extremely healthy, but that fever influenced his health for the rest of his life, really.
So he did survive fever, but I think it shows the risks that people who gave relief faced, and really faced the possibility of death as a result of their actions. So again, I think that's part of their bravery, that working with the poor made them vulnerable to catching these awful diseases that are associated with famine.
During the government's transfer from public works to soup kitchens in mid-1847, Strzelecki quickly realised that many people wouldn't be provided for. To fix this gap, he immediately got the British Relief Association to intervene. Such intervention helped save countless lives during that critical transfer period. Christine Keneally.
The British Relief Association really, again, Strzelecki understood very well what was going on, and he and his committee in London realised that relief from their association would actually demand for relief would increase during these months, and they filled the gap. They understood this and they stepped in and they filled the gap, which was very different from the British government, who guided by Trevelyan, were just happy for there to be a gap in relief provision.
From Dublin out to Mayo, in rain and sleet and frost, he travelled with persistence to help at any cost. The horror he encountered, the torment of the poor, gave him resolve to alleviate the blight at every door.
As was touched on already, because he was an experienced explorer, Strzelecki spent much time in the field travelling vast distances, where he assessed what was happening on the ground and tried to devise practical solutions to those many problems which he encountered. Sean Beattie, Donegal historian and editor of the Donegal Historical Journal.
Strzelecki actually visited Donegal, and I think he recognised the potential of the county because of its maritime situation, the fact that relief could come in by sea and that boats could bring in relief quicker to maritime areas. And there was a big problem, of course, when relief was coming in, that if it was being brought in by land, it had to be stored, it had to be placed in a secure place. But Strzelecki highlighted the fact that it could be brought in by sea and delivered that in that particular manner.
Strzelecki set to work at once, coordinating plans, making contacts everywhere, for he needed helping hands. Given so freely to the poor and starving man, the comfort of strangers fed the hungry in this land.
And it's important to stress that up to the year 1847, before Strzelecki arrived into Ireland, the normal method of helping famine victims was to provide relief to the parents first, who, being fed and employed, would, it was believed, care properly for their children. Paul De Strzelecki turned this traditional approach on its head, when in a stroke of genius he changed the focus from parents to children. Professor Christine Keneally.
We know from his letters he always had great concern for children and great compassion towards children. So one thing he decided to do when he arrived in Westport was to help the children. And he did this in such a practical way. There were a number of schools of all denominations in the area, and he told the managers of the schools that he would provide funding for the children in the schools to be fed. And each child who came to the school was to get a new suit of clothing, and every day they would get a substantial meal. And this was an incredible, incredible thing to do, because it not only helped the children, it helped the parents. It took off the parents that burden of worrying about their children. And when the children came to the school, part of the deal also was they had to comb their hair and wash their hands before they received the meal, which again, it seems a small thing, but I think it's important in terms of the dignity of the child. But also, this is a time of the spread of disease. Typhus was spread so easily, was spread through lice in the hair. So by doing this, he was probably preventing the spread of more disease. So in some ways, it was a very forward-thinking action. But the scheme was very successful, and so it spread from Westport to Mayo, and 1848, he asked the government if he could extend his school feeding scheme throughout the west of Ireland, and he was given permission to do so.
My name is Owen McGartle, and I think that Count Strzelecki played a major part in alleviating some of the suffering caused by the Irish famine, particularly his initiative in organising aid to the various national schools in Ireland, because the national school system was very well developed then, and it became the situation that when the children were properly fed, it took a lot of pressure off their parents, who were then able to focus on feeding themselves, and the lives of about 200,000 children were saved, which was an amazing achievement.
Some ideas may appear good on paper, but in practice just don't work out. But not so with Strzelecki's school scheme, which first began in Westport in County Mayo. As just touched on, at its height the scheme was providing relief to over 200,000 children from a total of 27 poor law unions in Ireland. One such union was in Clifton, where John Dean helped to oversee the scheme in local schools there. Kathleen Villiers-Tuttle, Connemara historian and author of the book Patient Endurance, The Great Famine in Connemara.
But I suppose the most benefit that you can see in the Clifton area, in the Clifton Union, was the establishment of a network of feeding stations for the children, when they decided that some of the funds that were coming from the British Relief Association were to be distributed through feeding the children. This was how they were going to manage it. And the word came down that the feeding stations were to be set up in the national schools. Now, in this area, we didn't have national schools because the Bishop of Tuam didn't allow the national school system into his diocese.
This would have been John McHale, the Line of the West.
Yeah, John McHale. And it meant that there were not enough national schools established in the whole union, throughout the union, for it to be of benefit to remote areas. So word went out, and both the Catholic and the Protestant clergy and the local landlords opened up schools immediately. Almost immediately schools were opened up so that the children could be fed in the schools. But also John Dean, when he saw the conditions of the children and the poor quality of their clothing, he put in place where some of the mothers and the older girls would have been employed manufacturing clothing. So they were not only fed, but they were also clothed. So this meant that over a period of time, from I think it was November 47 to May 48, there were about 500,000 rations distributed to about 5,000 children. So this saved these children from starvation.
That's a phenomenal figure, 500,000.
500,000 rations to just 5,000 children. So this fed the children, but they were also clothed, and then the women that were employed in manufacturing the clothes were given money, which meant that they could purchase food. So it was a huge benefit, and it was scattered out over the entire region. It saved children at a period of the famine that was particularly bad, where the weather was extremely bad, the conditions were very bad, the food scarcities were very, very acute, and also they had already suffered 2 years of famine at this stage, so you can imagine the conditions that these children were in. So this really brought them over the hump. It brought them over that bad period. And I really feel that those of us who are here today, those of us who are descendants of survivors of the famine, really have an awful lot to be grateful for, because it was our ancestors, these were the children that were saved at that particular time, and we are alive today because of it, and we're in Ireland today because of it.
It appeared to be the first ever occasion, certainly in the history of Ireland, and Ireland had a series of famines where this approach was taken, and apparently it has been an approach that's been used in many famines in Africa since then, because the school system was properly organised. And the big problem for many of the people who suffered hunger during the famine was that when they had to go into the workhouses, they contracted the famine fever, and many of them died simply by going into the workhouse. And the initiative to feed the children in the national schools meant that the children did not end up in the workhouses, and their parents didn't, and this was a key element in the success of it. Well, according to contemporaneous information at the time, the impact on the psychology of the parents was almost instant, and it meant that all over Ireland their feeling of guilt in not being able to look after the children was alleviated, and they became themselves more dynamic in being able to plan a way forward to their own survival.
Owen McGartle. Here's Kathleen Villiers-Tuttle once again.
The feeding of the children was vital, I would think, but also doing it through the education system meant that you were reaching into remote areas, so the children didn't have to go any further than the local school in order to be fed. It didn't mean that they had to travel 15 miles to the town or wherever, so or 4 or 6 miles even down to the local soup kitchen. So it meant that they were able to be fed locally, and they were able to be clothed locally, and that was extremely important. And I think really that, when you're doing a study on the famine, the question that's always at the back of your mind is, why did my family survive and why did they stay in Ireland? And it's little things like that that make it, you just sort of say, well, both my father's family and my mother's family were from remote regions, so they would not have had access to the town or to anything. And also the town was crowded anyway, with people moving in on top of it, trying to get assistance or trying to get some kind of food or begging or whatever. And you kind of feel, well, maybe that's why they survived. Maybe they survived because the British Relief Association sent funds that actually kept the schools open as feeding stations. It's as basic as that.
And it's worth pointing out that the United Nations adopted Paul De Strzelecki's schools relief ideas in helping those displaced by the Second World War. Marisa Tilley.
After the Second War, it was an organization, United Nations organizations, bringing help to the Europe. Europe was completely ruined, no food, no clothes, and they delivered to Europe basic goods for people to survive. And that organization adopted Strzelecki's model. They started with children to feed them, to put them into schools, to dress them in warm clothes, and I remember it because I was born at that time. I remember the goods which were coming from America, Switzerland, to help. The same they did for German children, because Germany was as damaged as other countries. So it was the same model of helping, of relief, accepted by the United Nations.
But unfortunately, in the summer of 1848, the highly successful schools feeding scheme began to be stopped. Christine Keneally.
By mid-1848, the British Relief Association was running out of funds, and he personally appealed to the British Prime Minister, Lord John Russell, and asked if the government would take over this very important work in feeding the school children. And John Russell promised that this would be the case, but in fact it didn't happen. When Charles Trevelyan, who was from the Treasury and was in charge of the distribution of government funding, heard about this, he said that this would not be in the spirit of what the government was doing to give free relief, even though it was just to children. And so in mid-1848, this very valuable scheme of feeding the school children came to an end. But when it was finally came to an end at this point, 200,000 school children were being fed every day. And that's just an incredible relief scheme, even by modern standards, logistically incredible. But in terms of the humanity and the understanding that children were so vulnerable and that they should be given relief without any restrictions was, again, such an act of great humanity. And it's impossible to measure or imagine how many lives were saved as a result of that.
Everybody has the child at heart, and he saw that, and I think he was able to put that into action.
Instead of giving first help and food for the adults, he actually kind of turned the whole process upside down, starting with the children. So obviously he uses the system of the Irish schools at the time, and that way he actually get to the core of the famine, to the poorest and to the most vulnerable society.
It seems like a simple thing now, but I think it was a credit of something like 200,000 children successfully came through that programme, which might not have if he wasn't there.
The numbers speak for themselves.
Without his intervention, I think that probably what would have happened is you would have had a much higher mortality rate amongst children.
That if he hadn't brought in his expertise and his management skills and the funding from the British Relief Association, it would have meant that an awful lot more people would have died from that period on, and certainly the children who were fed in the feeding stations in the schools, they wouldn't have survived.
He touched upwards of 200,000 people's lives, and it's very easy to say that number, but that's a massive amount of impact that he had on individuals. And, it just doesn't bear thinking about if he wasn't there and he wasn't applying himself. 200,000 people would not have benefited and would have had probably quite a tragic consequence. So I'm just glad that he did, and he stuck with it.
Nikt nie jest niezastąpiony. This is Polish saying, which means that everybody can be replaced by somebody else. But I don't really agree with this. I think there are people occasionally that you can't replace them. Strzelecki was one of those people.
To help the children was his plan, to feed them in their schools, to make them wash and comb their hair and abide by certain rules. Clothes and meals were given, children fed each day. Fighting hunger where he could, Strzelecki led the way. Given so freely to the poor and starving man, the comfort of strangers fed the hungry in this land. The comfort of strangers fed the hungry in this land.
On the 8th of July 1848, the British Relief Association formally ended its involvement in Ireland. Nevertheless, while the association's work was finished, Paul De Strzelecki himself returned to Ireland in mid-1848 to oversee the prudent distribution of more private charity. During this period, he also reported back to the British government on the horrendous situation still existing in Ireland. Christine Keneally.
The British Relief Association had at that stage disbanded, but the government, because they trusted him, he was a man who could be trusted, and he went to the west of Ireland on a fact-finding mission for the British government, and he reported that the situation was even worse than it had been in 1847, and he very unequivocally made an appeal for the British government to do more than it had been doing. So he was just an incredible spokesperson on behalf of the poor of Ireland, especially the poor in the west of Ireland, and more especially on behalf of children, the most vulnerable group in any famine situation.
He belongs to a cadre of individual who acts as a voice for the dispossessed.
Historian Sean Beattie.
The Irish people were being poorly represented in Parliament at this time, and a lot of obsession about land and about emphasis on rent. But he belonged to this cadre of individuals who were listened to, who had a certain status, who were able to articulate what they wanted to do, and who could get access to the media, to the newspapers, to the Times of London, which was read by parliamentarians. And you'd find that things that he did and things that he said were referred to in Parliament by parliamentarians or brought up in Parliament. So all these things had an important influence on legislation and on the granting of funds and the granting of money.
And after his famine relief work in Ireland, Paul De Strzelecki returned to London, where he devoted much of his time and energies assisting impoverished people living there to emigrate to a better life in Australia. But it wasn't just in the likes of Ireland and London that Strzelecki sought to comfort the afflicted and the dispossessed. During his earlier travels in Australia from 1839 to 1843, he became a champion of the rights of the native peoples. Marisa Tilley of the Kosciuszko Heritage Centre in Sydney, Australia.
From the beginning of his work in Australia and Tasmania. He highly respected Aboriginal people and their kind of life, their lifestyle. He wrote several letters to the Parliament, English Parliament, about how badly Aboriginal people are treated in Australia, and he protested with other scientists against a treatment of Aboriginal people in Australia.
From my time over there, he obviously had built up fairly good relationships with the Aboriginal people as well, which wasn't always the case, because I know that the traditional owners of the land around Kosciuszko are very welcome to a festival that's dedicated to Strzelecki every year, and in fact they're pretty involved in that festival on an annual basis. So that just shows you that he actually did have and did build good relationships with the Aboriginal people.
Ross Ryan from County Mayo, who himself explored the Strzelecki Desert in Australia in recent years. But it wasn't just Aborigines that Strzelecki befriended. He was also best friends with the British Prime Minister William Gladstone. Marisa Tilley.
He was the best friend of politicians like Prime Minister Gladstone. Prime Minister Gladstone was the last man from outside Strzelecki's house who saw him, who met him, official men, because then were lawyers as well. But he was the last friend who saw him in his bedroom, dying on his bed.
In 1873, wow.
It was in 1873, Prime Minister Gladstone went to his bedroom to see the dying man.
And although we'll never know what exact advice Strzelecki gave to Gladstone on Ireland, given Strzelecki's track record in Ireland, it's perhaps not surprising that Gladstone has gone down in history as the first British Prime Minister friend of Ireland. County Kildare historian Frank Taff.
I think he was the greatest friend that we ever had in a British Prime Minister. His disestablishment of the Irish Church, his 3 Home Rule bills all marked him out as a true friend of the Irish people. He consciously and quite deliberately tried to resolve the Irish troubles, let's put it that way, the Irish problem as the English saw it. And in fact, his own party disassociated himself from him at the end because of his attempt to do that. I think he was a true friend of the Irish nation.
Paul De Strzelecki died in October 1873. He was a Polish man with no connection to Ireland, yet he, perhaps more than any other individual, personifies the spirit of selflessness and sacrifice, which helped save untold numbers of lives during the Great Irish Famine. So why has the folk memory of Strzelecki's humanitarian work in Ireland remained forgotten about for so long? Why is his name not better known? Historian Owen McGartle.
I think that it's generally considered that after the famine and the catastrophic impact it had, that even the people of Ireland did not want to face up to the history of the famine. And in fact, Cecil Woodham Smith's book in the 1960s, The Great Hunger, was the first serious history of the famine, and she did mention Strzelecki. And I would say that the issue of blaming people for the famine, particularly Trevelyan, I think in a way took precedence over looking at the actual achievements of others, because most of the narrative of the famine, absolutely correctly, was about the abject failure of the British government to do what it could and was capable of doing, and also the whole issue of the food being exported from Ireland. So I think against that broad background of putting a global narrative on it, the achievement of Strzelecki was to some extent lost until now.
There's lots of people in Ireland who've never heard of Strzelecki.
He was one of those unsung heroes.
I really can't understand why he hasn't been recognised before.
Strzelecki's contribution, which has got lost in the mists of time.
And it's also, it's unknown even in Poland, because I checked in the Polish encyclopedia, and there is of course about him and about his traveling and so on, but there is no a word about his work here in Ireland. And even
famine relief work.
Nothing about famine. And even in the book of history of Ireland, written by well-known historian, Polish historian, and very extensive, very good book really, and there is plenty about famine, but he's not mentioned, so he's a little forgotten.
Hannah Dowling of the Irish-Polish Society. Here's historian Jerry Morn.
I think in time, probably the contribution that he makes during the famine will get the recognition that it deserves.
And until we meet again in some other hidden avenue of Irish history, well, I'm going to leave the last word with various contributors concerning the big lesson we have to learn from Paul De Strzelecki's humanitarian work in Ireland.
You have to serve somebody, like Bob Dylan is singing. You have to do something for other people, and Edmund Paweł Strzelecki was doing it, and it is the best way, even after hundreds years after this. Do something for other people.
But I think the lesson that strikes me is that while we are all preoccupied at a national level with our own issues, that we should take a little bit of mental time and a little bit of space to think about the issues of development and suffering and privation, humanitarian needs in other countries abroad.
In a world where the potential for evil in human nature often explodes in horrible deeds, that the huge potential for good in human nature, when it's tapped into, can realise wonderful things, as was the case with Strzelecki's work.
We are an island in one sense, but we're not an island. Human societies all have needs, all have requirements, all require emergency assistance, and we should be pulling and contributing at an international level to deal with those, just as Strzelecki did in the middle of the 19th century for us.
Given so freely to the poor and starving man, the comforts of strangers fed the hungry in this land. From Dublin out to Mayo, in rain and sleet and frost, he travelled with persistence to help at any cost. The horror he encountered, the torment of the poor, gave him resolve to alleviate the blight at every door. To help the children was his plan, to feed them in their schools, to make them wash and comb their hair and abide by certain rules. Clothes and meals were given, children fed each day. Fighting hunger where he could, Strzelecki led the way. Given so freely to the poor and starving man, the comfort of strangers fed the hungry in this land. The comfort of strangers fed the hungry in this land. The plight of those in Ireland touched their human nerve. Strzelecki did all he could, he gave without reserve. Given so freely to the poor and starving man, the comfort of strangers fed the hungry in this land. The comfort of strangers fed the hungry in this land.
funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.